fresh, I rock well.
I'm going to jump to talking about hip-hop culture a little bit. I'm sure there are some folks here who are very familiar with it and some who may not be as familiar. But this is really important to lay the foundation. So hip-hop culture has 4 or really 5 elements. We have MCing or rapping, DJing, and I'm housing beat making under that category. Graffiti is a visual aspect. B-boying, B-girling, breaking, breakdancing. And knowledge is the 5th element, and in particular knowledge of self. Now, I'm totally biased because I come from a family of psychoanalysts and psychotherapists, and I've been in my own therapy for a long time, which I think is really important for clinicians. But if you think about it, engaging in your own psychotherapy is really an exploration of knowledge of self, right? And working on your own metacognition and that kind of thing, learning about yourself. So arguably, it might be a stretch. People might not agree with me, but I think that's a very hip-hop kind of thing to do. And hip-hop really encourages reflection upon oneself, one's own identity, in the context of the community. Now, the reason that I'm bringing this up the stage is because when I was about 18, I saw a book on my folks' bookshelf that was Howard Gardner, who's a researcher at Harvard, he wrote a book called Frames of Mind, and it introduced the concept of multiple intelligences. He did research on veterans coming back from combat who had suffered TBI and head injury, and started to map out kind of different areas of the brain that corresponded to different skill sets or different intelligences. And so he established, and this is his original proposed multiple intelligences, although he's added to it since, but what we mainly test kids on in school, especially with standardized tests, is verbal, linguistic, and logical mathematical intelligence. And that's pretty limited. Not everyone learns that way, verbally by reading, decoding text, or writing, or through math, and that's not everyone's skill set. So why can't we teach them through these other intelligences, right? Why can't we use music, for example, which inherently contains mathematical aspects and time signature, beats, bars, etc., or for the more bodily kinesthetic, people that need to touch stuff, right, or need to hear it and touch and have a multi-sensory integration. Why aren't we using that? And what's really interesting is if you look at all of these multiple intelligences, you can find all of them in the elements of hip-hop. And why aren't we using a culturally responsive way, a way that pertains to students' reality and what they're interested in, to teach them content in school, to get them engaged? To me, it's pretty clear. Like, you should be doing that, and you should be using, even if, let's say, you're teaching 2nd or 3rd graders, right? Like, if they're into Pokemon, you should know about Pokemon, right? And you should be using that as a way to teach them, engage them, and have something that's relevant to their reality. So I want to take a minute and I'll just go through and quickly define these different intelligences in the different aspects or pillars of hip-hop. So verbal linguistic is obviously the capacity to use language, manipulate language, speak, write, read, decode text. Logical mathematical involves using logic and problem solving, math. Visual spatial has to do with our relation to space and our capacity to see, right, and notice kind of visual relationships. Bodily kinesthetic is, maybe playing sports or dancing. It can be fine motor movements, small, like, writing with a pencil or tying a shoelace. Gross motor movements, large motor movements, right, playing sports, etc. Musical, I think, is pretty self-evident. People who are naturally good at music, or just kind of that's their modality. Interpersonal is the capacity to read kind of nonverbal communication, nonverbal language, and to relate to others. Whereas intrapersonal is the capacity to look within and reflect within on one's own internal process. And I would assert, and someone might have made this point already, but intrapersonal is found in all of these elements of hip-hop, because hip-hop really comes from the community, right? Hip-hop started in the South Bronx with disenfranchised youth in one of the worst ghettos in the United States, with just a total lack of resources. And the city didn't care. People didn't care about the South Bronx. It was in total disarray. Landlords were lighting their tenements on fire to claim the insurance money, and it was just utter chaos. So you had a community-based movement of young people who empowered themselves, found a way to give themselves a voice and create their own narrative. Is, you know, a voice for the voiceless, predominantly African American, Afro-Latino youth, black and brown youth, who created something out of nothing in this really phenomenal way and created this culture. It's not just a type of music, it's a full-on culture. And that allows you to engage in certain discourses, to go and, like, you know, I go to Senegal, I may not speak so much Wolof, but you know, I can use this, I can engage in a cipher, a circle where people are rapping or dancing, and I know the protocol. I can come in, wait my turn, and then jump in and, you know, kick my rhyme or do my dance or whatever. And that's understood in hip hop culture across, you know, across different cultures, etc. So it really interpersonal, the capacity to engage with others, and interpersonal, you know, to reflect on one's own internal experience, is really part of all of those. You express yourself through graffiti. These are all expressive, and they have to do with happening in the context of the community. And I believe, even if you're, you know, a hermit in your cave making beats, the fantasy, and this is from a psychoanalytic perspective, but we're social creatures. It doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens in the context, the fantasy of, you know, how will others perceive us? What can I contribute to the community? Who, you know, what would someone think about this beat, etc. You know, so our creations have elements of us, and we put it out there into the world, even if it's via social media or on the internet, and it's on SoundCloud. It only has 2 plays. It doesn't matter, because there are 2 people that listen to that, and that's something we put out there. One other thing I want to note that's really important is the roots of, you know, of hip hop as an anti-violence movement, as a non-violent conflict resolution. I just watched a fantastic documentary I recommend everyone watch called Rubble Kings. It's a documentary about the gangs in the South Bronx and how the coming into hip hop and the birth of hip hop. And they're just sick of the killing and the violence, and so they tried to squash the beef, and then they kind of moved into expressing themselves, you know, through hip hop, through whether it was, instead of fighting and killing, they would settle turf disputes with, say, a breakdance battle, with breaking. And there's this kind of part of hip hop, the battle, which really is the sublimation of aggression, and one could argue sexual drives as well if we're thinking very psychoanalytically, but it doesn't even really matter. It's putting it into the culture, putting it into an artistic expression, and taking on a certain style and having that, as opposed to the, you know, violent conflict. So folks who try to, there's stereotypes about hip hop just being, you know, antisocial and misogynistic, et cetera. Well, the roots of hip hop and hip hop, you know, old school hip hop culture is not. It's quite the opposite in terms of trying to squash the beef and come together, form community. And so Africa Bambaataa started the Universal Zulu Nation and he used to be a former gang leader of the Black Spades, brought together everyone under the banner of the Universal Zulu Nation, whose, you know, informal slogan was peace, love, unity, and having fun. So that's something that we can teach youth, and really hip hop is naturally has this kind of therapeutic and community building aspect to it.
To be fresh, I rock well.